What does a cardiologist think of the keto diet? If you have heart disease or don't want to have heart disease later in life, you really should not be eating that much saturated fat.
That's why I disagree.
But if you want to live a really long time, switch to a better, more well-rounded diet.
What does a cardiologist think of keto? I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome back to a Reacts video. Dr. Alo is a cardiologist who is also a personal trainer in the past and has lots of thoughts about keto diets, and I think the thoughts are typical of a traditionally trained cardiologist. So let's see what the comments are and see if we can figure out if the concerns, of course he has concerns that he has are valid ones.
What does a cardiologist think of the keto diet? So some of you don't know me, I'm a cardiologist. I'm also a certified personal trainer. I've been studying and talking about weight loss and lecturing about it for almost 20 years now. I'm going to go over all of the research and all the studies on what the science shows about the keto diet. Now, for all of you, before we begin, I know that diets are a bit of a sensitive topic to people because a lot of people view their diet as a religion. I tell people, and if you read my book, you'll find out that I'm diet agnostic. I really don't care what diet you follow. The research has shown that regardless of what macronutrient breakdown you follow, if the weight comes off, then your cardiovascular markers all improved. So back to keto, which is what we're trying to get at today. So there's been a lot of talk in the news. Now the keto diet, for those of you who don't know, it's a high fat, high protein, almost no carb diet, similar to Atkins and South Beach. Atkins came out in the 1990s, and it was more high protein and low carb. South Beach diet was Dr. Agaston, who's actually also a cardiologist that invented the heart scan, the CT scan for the coronaries. He came out with South Beach diet. So instead of eating, unhealthy proteins and fats, why don't we swap them out for healthier proteins and fats and, make the Atkins diet a little healthier?
Well, that's an interesting description. Actually, Dr. Atkins wrote his first book in the 1970s, 1972. In the 1990s, there was a republication of the Dr. Atkins' New Diet Revolution, and that's when I became aware of it. Two of my patients followed the Atkins diet and lost over 50 pounds each. It was a remarkable event for my patients to lose weight at the time. That's how I got curious and started to do research on low-carb keto diets. But this is around the year 2000, the Atkins diet was getting more interest. We started studying and publishing some papers on the Atkins diet. We didn't call it that. We called it low carb, high fat. And then at 2003-ish, Dr. Atkins dies. He falls on the ice in New York City and bumps his head, bleeds into his brain. He dies. Well, the Atkins had a clinic that was actually in its prime heyday when I visited there in 1998. It was on 4 stories, Midtown Manhattan, and it had lots of patients. Dr. Atkins was actually using the diet in clinical practice. Dr. Agaston wrote the South Beach diet, and best of my knowledge, he never really used the diet in his practice before writing the book. It was the merging of the low-carb idea with the old low-fat idea. So keeping the healthy fats is the way he remarks on it. Well, it was kind of like the merging of things that really had never been used together, and Dr. Atkins would never limit fats or say that there was healthy, a steak was just fine, saturated fat was just fine, which is what the researchers say. So I don't put Dr. Atkins and Dr. Agaston on equal footing in terms of their clinical experience and in fact in the books that they wrote. Now, full disclosure, I'm an author on The New Atkins for a New You, which was published in 2010. Because Dr. Atkins had died, they wanted to come up with a newer book, and the Atkins company asked Dr. Finney Volek and myself to author the book. We don't get royalties from it. We were paid on a contractual basis. So just to let you know, I helped with rewriting the Atkins book. But Dr. Atkins and Dr. Agaston had very different experiences. But the South Beach diet was launching right when Dr. Atkins died, and so it became very popular because the low carb nature is going to lead to weight loss. The first phase of the South Beach diet is very low carb. The blending of the low fat idea was never really studied in clinical practice, and it actually makes it kind of harder to do on a day-to-day basis because you don't get the full fat glory of an Atkins type of diet when you're not worrying about the fats. But interesting to hear his thumbnail, which was not quite full of the nuance there.
Both of whom were doctors, Dr. Atkins, obviously, and Dr. Gaston. So that's kind of where it started. Now it's been taken to another level where it's more fat than protein. Now, of course, don't, bombard me with comments because, you modified the keto diet and you eat more protein. It's totally fine. There are different variations of it, but the vast majority of people that follow a keto diet follow it with the higher fat intake, and there's been tons and tons of studies on this. Now, the keto people will always go and say, well, the Ansel Keys 7 country studies, the SCS study was a little bit biased or something like that. That was a study from 1958. There have been thousands of follow-up studies now talking about red meat and saturated fat and all that and how it relates to heart disease. So first of all, you can do the keto diet if you want to. If you feel that that's a really good way for you to adhere to a calorie restriction, then have at it. Do the keto diet. Now, there are some people that should not do the keto diet or keto style heavy fat diets. These are cardiac patients. These are mostly my patients. If you have heart disease, or don't want to have heart disease later in life, you really should not be eating that much saturated fat.
That's why I disagree. And I have lots of patients who have cardiac disease, and I put them on a low carb, high fat diet. I have to say my approach is more like the old Atkins approach than the new pop culture keto diet, which could be very confusing. And I agree, it's probably higher in fat, but I don't know that it's necessarily bad because you're burning the fat that you're eating. And then, of course, as he said at the beginning, the weight loss kind of overwhelms all of the macronutrient differences. It's a good thing to lose weight. But the idea that saturated fat is bad has changed from the research level of looking at nutritional epidemiology and coming up with a possible mechanism to scientists getting together basically saying there's no evidence that saturated fat is harmful. And again, we're going to get into apples and oranges here a lot because the studies that he's talking about are among carb eaters. And you could overgeneralize, which means you take this information and say it applies to those who don't eat carbs, but it would be almost like saying what we find here on the Earth is similar to what will happen on the moon when we know the gravity is different and you're going to be able to leap farther on the moon. So actually, I don't think we're going to find that these same findings are relevant for the carb eaters and for those who don't eat carbs. It's a very different metabolism. And I'm not worried about the saturated fat like the old paradigm doctors are, especially most cardiologists are in the old paradigm that they think that saturated fat or even cholesterol in the food raises the cholesterol and causes heart disease. And that still is a hypothesis. It's really never been proven.
We'll go over the evidence and I'll put all the studies up here in a second. You really shouldn't be eating that much saturated fat. So why? So tons of studies have been done now and I'll link tons of them below. Actually, they're all in my book. If you want to grab my book, you can grab it on Amazon for around 18 to 25 bucks, depending on which version you want. But for, down here, you can grab the PDF for much, much cheaper. But either way, the studies will be listed and you'll have access to all of them. But saturated fats have been shown without question now. Like anybody who tells you, well, no, saturated fats are good for you, a little bit is good for you. And if you're super lean and you're not overweight or morbidly obese, you don't have high inflammation, the number one cause of inflammation is obesity. If you're very obese and overweight, saturated fat in red meat takes a toll on your body. Saturated fat in red meat especially is very atherogenic. There's not a single study, you won't find a single study that shows that red meat doesn't raise cholesterol. Not one. There's not one single study that shows increasing your intake of red meat does not raise cholesterol. Now,
well, this is fascinating. Let's disentangle this a little bit. We went from talking about studies where red meat raises cholesterol to red meat is harmful for the heart. And actually, this is what's happened through the years is the goalposts for a treatment, a change in the food, or even a drug have been moved so that you don't even have to show that the drug that's changing cholesterol saves lives. If you show that the drug changes the cholesterol, it will be approved for that use. When you need to know if there are any harmful effects of these drugs, and lowering cholesterol is fraught with trouble in side effects with memory loss and muscle cramps and myopathy. And in my limited experience, there was one person who was bedridden and nobody suspected, this is lots of doctors involved, nobody suspected that it might be the statin medication that was causing the myopathy to cause someone to be bedridden. So no one thought to stop the drug. A new doctor came in and said, hey, why don't we just stop any drug that might be a possible offender? And the person gets better, like from bedridden to out of bed and walking. So is it rare? I don't know the actual, the rate of these occurrences, but they happen. And so I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's a role for treatment with these medications. But the idea that you can use the changing of a cholesterol as your endpoint, it really isn't right. You need the endpoints of the death and dying, the mortality of any intervention to know if the risks are outweighed by the benefits. But this is kind of classic of old paradigm thinking. We'll even kind of confuse dietary cholesterol and saturated fat with blood cholesterol and atherosclerosis, and we'll just all treat it with medication. I think we can do better than that. We can personalize this, and to say the blanket statement that if you're young and you don't want to get heart disease, don't eat saturated fat is really just kind of ridiculous for everyone. I mean, there are some families that don't get heart disease. It's true. So if heart disease doesn't run in your family, even in the context of a typical American diet, you're not going to have to worry too much about what you've been eating. But, oh, that's right, he mentioned in the context of his clinic, remember he's a cardiologist. So he's got this selection bias of, well, everyone I see has heart disease. Well, of course, you're a cardiologist. So there are people who don't get heart disease and they don't have to change their diet and worry about saturated fat, right? Dr. Allo, I think you would agree, or maybe not. I came to this aha moment when a family relative of mine was worked up for heart disease, meaning had all of the tests done to see if he had heart disease. He didn't have it, but when he left the hospital, he was told to do a low-fat diet to prevent heart disease that he didn't have. So you can actually measure to see if you've had these problems and have a disease. You don't want to take a medicine to prevent a disease that isn't highly likely in your family or a disease that you don't have. You know, if you're 70 years old and you don't have any evidence of atherosclerosis, why would you want to take a medicine to reduce your chances of getting atherosclerosis? Because you don't have it. So there's a lot of dumbing down or oversimplification of the categorization of risk for people and also the treatment with medications, because lifestyle does a lot in terms of treatment.
There are some people say, well, what about this recent study or this recent guideline that was published saying saturated fat is not an issue anymore? That was October 2019. There was this group of people that looked at one single study where they took people who ate about 10% of their total calories from saturated fat and lowered it to like 8 or 9% or something around that much. They were eating like 10 to 12% of their calories from saturated fat, lowered it to like 8 or 9%, and we really didn't see a difference in cardiovascular outcomes. So the problem with that study, if you actually read it or read other studies, and I always tell people you have to look at the totality of evidence. One single study and then changing the guidelines based on one single study is just insane. But that one single study, if you look at it, they lowered people's total saturated fat levels by minimal. Like you're already eating almost 10% cholesterol, and now you're lowering it to 8 or 9%. There's not going to be a huge difference.
So time out. I'm not sure what study he's talking about. The one that I cite is the article by Arnie Astrup, A-S-T-R-U-P-A, Arnie, and the last author is Krauss, Ron Krauss, and it's called Saturated Fats and Health, a Reassessment and Proposal for Food-Based Recommendations, and it's in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. and it's a state-of-the-art review. And so that is the one that I talk about when I say that the researchers are relaxed about saturated fat in the food. The clinical cardiologists haven't gotten that message yet. They may never change their view, actually. It has become almost a religion for some.
Now, we have seen that when people lowered their saturated fat intake significantly, like for example the Finland study, and I have like a whole video on the Finland study, but if you look at the Finland study, where an entire population of people was eating kind of almost keto. They were rural people, lots of butter, lots of dairy, lots of meat.
Did you catch that? Almost keto?
Red meat, chicken skin, all that stuff, butter, bacon, cheese, all the saturated fat. 23 to 26% of their calories were coming from saturated fat. They reduced those calories down to about 10% or less, and you saw a 84% reduction in cardiovascular mortality. Other studies based on Ansel Keys data and that same data set of people, they continued to follow them. Later studies were published where people ate more of this, they call it a Cretan diet or Mediterranean diet. People ate more of a Mediterranean style diet. Their all-cause mortality went down by 55%, cardiovascular mortality went down by 77%, and all kinds of reductions that are just tremendous. So it makes no sense to look back.
I have to just editorialize that the studies were done under the best circumstances that they could, but the limitations are huge. And to study populations like that with accuracy and precision is really hard. And I have to just say that the blinders or the lens through which those studies were done was under the paradigm that saturated fat was bad. And you can often see what you want to see, use relative risk instead of absolute risk. We've talked about those things, or the kind of statistical sleight of hand. And I think the onus is upon us to create new studies with the internet, with the new capability of taking pictures of foods, and we can do studies that are much better, and we really shouldn't cite studies that are 50 years old.
It makes no sense to look back at a study from 1958 and saying, well, it was this one bad study, but the keto people love doing that. Like if you look at Gary Taubes.
I guess I'm a keto person. No, people first language have taught me that this person is not obese. This person has obesity or is affected by obesity. I guess I'm a person affected by a keto diet or following a keto diet. I'm not a keto people person. I'm more than that.
Look at Gary Taubes. His name's Dr. Gary Taubes. He's not a doctor, he's a journalist, but he's a doctor. Regardless, he publishes a lot of books on keto, and he's been debated on YouTube. You can look up debates with him. At conferences he's been debated. He basically said in many of his debates that, look, even if you bring me evidence to prove to me that I'm wrong and my data is all wrong and my studies are all wrong, I'm not going to change my mind. I still think that the only way to lose weight is keto. And
well, I'm sorry, I have to stick up for Gary Taubes. If you have never heard of his name, Taubes, Gary spent 5 years in a New York City flat, right when I was doing our original research on the Atkins diet, low carb, high fat, or keto diet. The first phase of Atkins is keto because it uses nutritional ketosis. He spent 5 years in a flat and wrote this pioneering work called Good Calories, Bad Calories. It's a must read if you're still hung up on what Dr. Allo is talking about in terms of the old studies and the proof of with these studies being done, the Karelia, the Finland study. No, the first half of Good Calories, Bad Calories basically shows how that weak science got perpetuated, and it was that book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, was very influential and helpful for me to kind of come to grips with how could I have been taught something that was so incomplete. I say it's not necessarily wrong, but it's incomplete and overgeneralized. And Gary's work has really helped with that. He then wrote Why We Get Fat, The Case for Keto, where he interviewed over 100 keto practitioners around the world. And then the last book, The Case Against Sugar, basically tells the story of sugar being given a blank a free ride and never studied is harmful. Still today, you can't find sugar being targeted as a possible concern, and it's biased research finding, I think the long story short is that the industry has funded so many people to either study exercise or fat that nobody has studied sugar as a cause for disease. They've been unable to because there hasn't been funding for it, or they've been distracted by the exercise research, the low-fat diets, the drugs that are being used. So Gary Taubes, don't diss Gary Taubes, please, Dr. Allo. And sure, we all get dogmatic at times, and Gary can be dogmatic to stand in a position. Gary Taubes has a new book coming out about diabetes and the history of diabetes. It's a fascinating read on how things got messed up and kind of sloppily changed. I was able to comment on the one of the drafts that Gary wrote and gave him feedback on it. But I think Gary has been very helpful as a clear-minded thinker, and actually created a foundation to fund science called NUSI. And the NUSI initiative has been very helpful to shed light on low-carb diets and even just diets in general.
That's another problem that I have with people who have diet religions. When they say the only way to lose weight, or the only way to lose weight based on science is keto or intermittent fasting, like Jason Fung, Dr. Jason Fung, nephrologist from Canada, wrote the book Obesity Code. Basically says that the only way on earth to lose weight is intermittent fasting. Now and he says calories in, calories out don't matter. Well, I mean, that's funny.
Well, now don't mess with Jason Fung either. No, I've only met Jason a couple times. He doesn't come to our obesity medicine meetings frequently, but has a coaching company that uses intermittent fasting and wrote the books, not only Obesity Code, but Diabetes Code and Cancer Code. And I have to agree with Dr. Allo that if you say this is the only way, I think you're getting a little promotional, but you have to understand that promotion is, and having people feel comfortable that they're doing something that works is part of the art of medicine and helping someone do a lifestyle change. But Dr. Jason Fung has done a lot of good in advancing taking away the focus just on calories. And there's a great comment that Gary Taubes made, a little anecdote or clarification on this calories thing. And calories do matter. They do. And if you really nail down anyone in this world, they will say, yes, calories matter, of course. So if someone's losing weight, by definition of what we know in the world, they're eating fewer calories. If someone's gaining weight, they're eating more calories than they're burning. I mean, this is by definition, it's called a tautology. So, and it's not very helpful. So Gary Taubes some years ago on a podcast said it this way, that let's say we're looking at a restaurant that's crowded, and you ask me, why is that restaurant crowded? And I say, well, more people went in than came out of the restaurant. That's why it's crowded. And I said, wait a second. I know that. I know more people went in than came out. Why is it crowded? I mean, is it good food? And your friend goes, no, it's more people went in than came out. That's why it's crowded. And you would think this was kind of a ridiculous conversation. When Gary talked about obesity and being a tautology and how it's not helpful, and is it good food at the restaurant? Is it great service? Is it a great view? Why is it so crowded? It's popular, and so I couldn't really take seriously my colleagues in the obesity world who said, we know what causes obesity. More calories go in than came out. And so I know, in fact, that a tautology means that it's ridiculously true. Of course that's true. It's not helpful. And because a lot of the scientists signed off on, we know the cause, it's calories, and they close their mind to things like low-carb diets, like the idea that carbohydrates and insulin response to a certain food might vary the effect of the calories. They just stop thinking. And that it really, I think, has been a detriment to the research in the obesity space, that they signed off that it was just calories without regard to what the calories are doing and why some calories are harder to avoid and to stop consuming than others. So kind of like why is the restaurant crowded. Well, more people went in than came out. Why is that patient obese? Well, he ate more than he burned. Well, we know that. It's just not helpful.
But if calories in, calories out isn't working for you, that's a whole other story. We'll get to that in another video. But the studies that he looked at didn't even measure calories in and calories out. And he looked at intermittent fasting. If there have been studies now comparing intermittent fasting that are with an isocaloric diet that's continuous eating all throughout the day, multiple studies now, you get the same amount of weight loss, same amount of reduction in cardiovascular risk factors. The studies have all shown that if you lose weight, regardless of how you lose that weight, then you will improve all of your cardiovascular markers, all your inflammatory markers, cholesterol, insulin resistance, uric acid, high sensitivity CRP, anything you can imagine that measures inflammation or measures, actual death rates and all that, all comes down. So I'm not telling you not to do keto, but if you want to live a really long time, and even young people, if you want to do keto for a little bit of time just to get some weight off, but then switch to a better, more well-rounded diet, that's fine.
Well, so interesting. Kind of a lot of mainstream folks are saying, well, okay, keto works for weight loss, but you don't want to do it very long because it's going to get you at some point. Well, there's no evidence for that. Did you see any evidence presented about that? In fact, when we don't eat for 3 days, all humans go into a fat-burning mode. It's called nutritional ketosis. Even the most staunch anti-keto person is going to be happy that they can go into nutritional ketosis if they don't have food for 3 days. This is just what we do because we have fat stored on our body as the storage form of energy. So I don't see any. So you young people, if you're feeling great, you're eating foods you love, and you're not having all of the junk food, and this is the commonality of pretty much all the popular diets that have been studied and have been shown to be helpful, is we're not telling people to have the junk. And yes, you can pretty much see junk food. When you see it, it's in a wrapper, it's in a box, it's in a bag. And the common element of all of the diets that we're talking about, and I agree with Dr. Allo that there are a lot of ways to go about this, and there's a science saying there are a lot of ways. There's no one better way than another unless you put them side by side in a race or in a clinical trial when you have a comparative sort of program side by side.
The other issue, I tell people, the only diet that's ever been proven to reduce all, cardiovascular mortality and reduces about 12 different kinds of cancer is the Mediterranean diet. And if you don't know what that is, it's easy to look up. It's lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, olive oil, canola oil, things like that are, very wholesome and nutritious. Obviously makes sense. That's what works. Now, a lot of people say, well, I do keto because it gives me more energy. It can.
Well, getting back to the Mediterranean diet, I'm afraid there's still aren't lots of randomized trials of the Mediterranean diet for heart disease prevention. There's really just one. And the idea of a Mediterranean pattern has been looked at in other nutritional epidemiology studies. But the sad state of affairs is that the Mediterranean diet hasn't been studied very much either. Most of the studies that are going on have to do with mechanisms or drug treatments of things. We need studies comparing a Mediterranean diet to a keto diet for heart disease treatment and prevention, or a vegan diet or vegetarian. These studies just haven't been done. And it kind of defies my understanding that the cardiology community has glommed onto this one randomized trial to say the Mediterranean diet is best. And I think because it doesn't mean it's not high fat and it's not high protein, it's a different word. And most people don't really know what a Mediterranean diet is. There are many different kinds. And finally, Dr. Delorgerel, who was the PI or the lead investigator of the Lyon Heart Study, one of the studies that showed you could reduce recurrent heart attacks with a Mediterranean diet, he doesn't fear fat. He doesn't fear saturated fat. He's a cardiologist, did the Mediterranean diet study that cardiologists in the U.S. cite, and yet he doesn't worry about saturated fat. So there's a lot of disconnect going on here. And we need more studies of all of these diets to be able to say with confidence that one is better than another. In the meantime, don't have the typical American junk if your body doesn't respond in a way that is not inflammatory or causing chronic illness. And there are those rare few people who can eat just anything. It's kind of like your aunt that smoked till she was 100 years old. It can happen, but it doesn't happen frequently. It's not worth taking that chance, in my opinion.
And people do feel good on it. And if you feel good on it, that's fine. But they've also looked at people who are in a calorie restriction versus, same amount of calories, keto versus non-keto. They all feel better when you're calorie restricted and you're, burning fat and you're, burning energy as opposed to eating it all and gaining weight or maintaining your weight. You do feel better. You get some mental clarity, some mental fog goes away. So that's all been shown. The other thing I don't like about keto is that it severely limits athletic performance. Now, sure, you could look at, well, look at this athlete, look at that athlete, they're keto only, and this is, they're doing these amazing things. Sure, there are exceptions to the rule. The vast majority of us, you run marathons, endurance sports, even strength athletes, you need carbohydrates. As a personal trainer, we tweak your macros, your fats, proteins, carbohydrates to match your goals. If your goal.
So that's been the traditional teaching of the personal training, bodybuilding, the athletic world. And in a movie called Serial Killers, Cereal, not Serial, Serial Killers, Professor Tim Noakes of Cape Town, South Africa, the doctor who wrote the book, The Lore of Running, he taught people to eat carbs while they were to run a marathon. He, in that movie, rips out his chapter and says, I was wrong. You shouldn't run on carbs, your body on carbs when you're doing athletic performance sorts of exercise. And so, Dr. Allo, I would like you to read a little bit of what Tim Noakes and Jeff Volek is writing about the latest exercise information. And when you're doing low-carb keto diets, it actually is looking pretty good that you can do better, maybe even that little extra 1% that would make you win a race. And the interesting thing about the keto diet is it spawned now these keto supplements that are being studied for lots of different medical things and performance. But the Serial Killers and then Serial Killers 2 are movies that talk about elite athletes doing keto or low carb, high fat, which is a keto diet. And the husband-wife team in Serial Killers 2 rows in a rowboat from San Francisco to Hawaii, breaking the world's record by 15 days or something, from 60 days to 45 days. And it's the story of how they did a keto diet for 6 months to prepare their body for this heroic type of exercise. I wonder, Dr. Allo, if the average person who tries a keto diet and then starts running and doesn't feel good, that they haven't taken enough time to keto adapt. It may take 3 to 6 months to fully keto adapt if you're doing that high level performance, or they might not be getting enough salt supplementation or electrolyte supplementation, which is kind of a theme that if you're keto adapted, you want to make sure you're having plenty of salt. If you're craving salt, have salt.
Are to get stronger, get bigger muscles, or endurance type sports, you are going to need carbohydrates. There's just no question about it. Sure, there are exceptions to the rule. And if you want to do keto, I'm not against you. Go for it, but select healthier fats. The creatine diet or the Mediterranean diet, a lot of studies have been done where they just took out saturated fat and substituted it for polyunsaturated, monounsaturated. Significant reductions in mortality, all-cause mortality as well as cardiovascular mortality. So that would be my thoughts on the keto diet. If you enjoyed it, grab my book. All the studies are in there, and I'll put some of them on the screen as well as in the links below.
So I think this is a classic, common, old paradigm interpretation of something new. And so people who are trained in a certain way are going to try to make sense of how can you eat more saturated fat and still be healthy. How can you eat more fat and lose weight was the first question people had. And well, it's because the rest of the day you're eating fewer calories and you're burning your body fat as part of your calorie source. So the first thing that we had to establish in our clinical trials is that you can lose weight by eating more fat, because you're actually eating fewer calories when you look at the whole day. We had to first show that the hunger went down compared to other types of diets automatically. So you do a keto diet today or a low carb, high fat diet, the hunger goes away in just a day or two. And if you have extra weight on your body, you start burning your body fat, and you can lose 1 to 2 pounds per week of body fat. So I can understand why it's difficult and there's concern, but I don't see data to back up that concern. Nothing he said dissuades me from still teaching a low-carb diet with keto, nutritional ketosis involved in my clinic at Duke. I hope that's helpful. Please click like, subscribe, ring the notification bell. If you don't have my top 10 tips on how to do keto right, check in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out AdaptYourLifeAcademy.com.